It was my granddaughter who handed me the envelope. She was 9 years old, standing in the doorway of my workshop in her pajamas, holding a manila folder that was too big for her small hands. Her hair was still messy from sleep. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she whispered, "Grandpa, I think Mommy is doing a bad thing. But please don't tell her I told you. I want you to understand something before I go any further. I am 68 years old. I have built houses with my own hands. I have buried a wife I loved for 41 years. I have raised one son and watched him become a decent man. I have lived through 3 recessions and 1 cancer scare. I thought I had seen the shape of every kind of pain a man can carry. I had not. My name is Hollis Truitt. I live just outside Beaufort, South Carolina, in a low-country house I built in 1987 with cedar siding and a wraparound porch that took me 2 summers to finish. My wife Margaret and I raised our son Ennis in that house. When Margaret died of ovarian cancer in 2019, I thought the worst thing that could happen to me had already happened. I sold the construction business to my foreman, kept the workshop out back, and started taking on small jobs to keep my hands busy. Custom cabinets, built-ins, a rocking chair here and there. Ennis married a woman named Brizette 4 years before his mother got sick. She came from up north somewhere, Connecticut I think, and she had the kind of polished smile you see on women who sell expensive real estate. She was 32 when they married. He was 38. She told us at the rehearsal dinner that she had always wanted a big Southern family, and Margaret cried because Margaret cried easily at anything that sounded like love. I should have looked closer. I know that now. But Margaret was alive then, and Ennis was happy. And I was a man who had been taught not to interfere in other people's marriages. They had Tilda the next year. My granddaughter. The little girl in the doorway with the manila folder. Now. The envelope. Tilda had been spending the night with me. Brizette had asked 3 weeks earlier if I could start taking her every Friday. She said Ennis was working late on a project for the firm. She said she needed time to decompress. I didn't think anything of it. A grandfather and his only grandchild on a Friday night is not a hardship. It's a gift, and I had been making it the best night of her week. We watched old westerns. I taught her how to plane a piece of pine. We ate grilled cheese. That Saturday morning, she came into the workshop with the folder, and she would not look at me. I sat her down on the stool I had built her, the small one with her initials carved into the leg, and I asked her what was in the folder. She said she had found it in her mother's bedroom closet, in a shoebox, the one Brizette had told her never to touch. Tilda was a careful child. She was not the kind to snoop, but she had been looking for her old ballet slippers, and the slippers were in the shoebox, and the papers were under the slippers. I opened the folder. The first thing inside was a printed email. The second was a printout of a text thread. The third was a photograph, an actual photograph, the kind you have to go to a CBS to print. And I think Brizette must have printed it for some other purpose. Maybe a frame, maybe a Christmas card she ended up not sending, because the photograph was of her, with my son's business partner, a man named Garth Pelletier, who had been to my house for Thanksgiving the year before. In the photograph, they were on a balcony I didn't recognize. He had his arm around her waist. Her hand was inside the front of his shirt. They were both laughing. I sat down. I think I sat down. I remember the stool, and I remember the smell of sawdust, and I remember Tilda saying, "Grandpa? Grandpa, are you okay?" I told her I was fine. I told her she had done the right thing. I told her that whatever happened next, she was not in trouble, and she was not the reason, and I needed her to do one thing for me, just one thing. I needed her to put the folder back exactly where she found it. And I needed her to never tell her mother she had seen it, and I needed her to act normal. She nodded. She was 9. She nodded like a soldier. Then she said, "Grandpa, it gets worse." I asked her what she meant. She said, I heard Mommy on the phone last week. She said, after the will changes, we can be done with all of this. She said your name. That is when I understood that this was not a love affair. This was a plan. I did not call my son that day. I did not call my son that day. I did not call my lawyer that day. I did not throw anything. Although God help me, I wanted to put my fist through the wall of my own workshop. I drove Tilda home that afternoon and I kissed her forehead and I told Brizette that Tilda had been an angel, and Brizette smiled her polished smile. And I drove back to my house and I sat on the porch with a glass of bourbon I didn't drink, and I made myself think. Here is what I knew. I knew that 6 months earlier Ennis had asked me, awkwardly, over coffee, whether I had updated my will since Margaret died. I told him I hadn't. He said I should. He said Brizette had been talking to a financial advisor, and she said it was important for everyone's protection that the family assets be properly structured. He said it like he was reading from a card. I knew that 3 months earlier, Brizette had invited me over for dinner and steered the conversation, very gently, toward the workshop and the 4 acres it sat on. She said it must be such a burden to maintain. She said maybe it was time to think about the future. She said Ennis worried about me out there alone. I knew that 2 months earlier my son had brought home a man from his firm, an estate attorney, supposedly to help me with some paperwork. I had told them I would think about it. I had not thought about it. I had let the man leave a thick packet of documents on my kitchen table, and I had not opened them. I knew that 1 month earlier, Brizette had started asking me, very casually, about my blood pressure medication. About whether I was remembering to take it. About whether I had told my doctor I sometimes forgot things. I had not told my doctor that because it was not true. I had not forgotten anything in my life since the day Margaret died, and even that day I remember in detail. I wish I didn't. I knew. I had known. I had been letting myself not know, and now I had a granddaughter with a manila folder. That night I called the only person in the world I trusted with this. Her name was Odell Pickney, and she had been Margaret's best friend for 40 years, and she was a paralegal at a firm in Charleston, and she had a son who was a private investigator. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting. When I was done, she said, Hollis, you are not going to do anything stupid. You are not going to confront her. You are not going to tell your son. You are going to listen to me very carefully. I listened. She said the first thing was the will. If I had not signed anything yet, I had time. She said the second thing was evidence. A photograph wasn't enough. A text thread on a printout wasn't enough. We needed the real thing. Originals, the kind of proof that would hold up if Ennis ever doubted me. And Ennis would doubt me because Ennis loved his wife and he was about to find out his wife was a stranger. The third thing, she said, was that I should not change my behavior. Not by an inch. If Brizette suspected I knew, the whole thing would collapse, and not in my favor. I asked her about Tilda. I asked her whether I was going to have to drag a 9-year-old child into a courtroom. She said, no. We are going to protect that little girl with everything we've got. But she's the one who started this, Hollis. She knew. At 9 years old, she knew her mother was rotten, and she came to you. Don't waste what she gave you. I want to tell you about the next 6 weeks because the next 6 weeks are when I stopped being a grieving widower and started being something else. I'm not sure I have a word for what I became. My son would say I became cold. My daughter-in-law, on the day everything finally came out, would say I became a monster. I would say I became a father again, not a father to my son, who was already a man, but a father to that little girl who had handed me an envelope and looked at me like I was the only safe thing left in her world. Odell's son was named Kobe. He was 36, ex-military, ran a small investigations firm out of North Charleston. He came to my house on a Tuesday and we sat in the kitchen and I told him everything. He took notes. He didn't say much. At the end he said, Mr. Truitt, I want you to know something. Cases like this, where there's a child involved who saw something, they break in one of two ways. Either the parent finds out the kid talked and the kid pays for it, or we move fast enough that the kid never has to know she was the one who pulled the thread. We are going to do the second one. I almost cried at the kitchen table of my own house in front of a man I had just met. I did not. I shook his hand and we got to work. Kobe put a tracker on Brizette's car. Legal in our state because the car was registered jointly in Innes's name, and Kobe was retained by a family member, although I'll spare you the legal acrobatics. Within 10 days, he had a complete map of her week. Tuesday afternoon, she met Garth Pelletier at a condo in Hilton Head that Garth owned under an LLC. Thursday afternoons, they met at a hotel near the Savannah airport. The Friday nights when Tilda was with me, Brizette wasn't decompressing. She was driving to Atlanta and back, where Garth's actual primary residence was, the one his actual wife didn't know about either. That's right. The man my son thought was his friend, the man who had eaten my Thanksgiving turkey, was married to a woman in Atlanta with 3 kids of his own. Brizette knew. Of course Brizette knew. The text thread Tilda had found made it clear. They had been planning for at least a year how to transition. Garth was going to leave his wife once Brizette had secured things on her end. Securing things on her end meant getting me declared incompetent, getting Ennis to sign over power of attorney, restructuring the trust Margaret and I had built over 40 years so that Brizette controlled it, and then leaving my son with a fraction of what he thought was coming to him, while she walked away with the rest into Garth's arms. Tilda would have stayed with Ennis. They had discussed this. In a text thread, Brizette wrote, "He can have her. She's too much like him anyway. Mopey. Mopey." About her own daughter, the little girl in the pajamas. I read that line 3 times in Copy's car in a parking lot in Beaufort. And I want to tell you, I have never in my life felt what I felt then. It was not rage. Rage is hot. This was cold. This was the cold of a man who has finally, after 68 years, understood exactly what he is willing to do. Here is what we did. First, I went to my own attorney, an old friend of mine named Bram Doolittle who had handled my business for 30 years. I told him everything. He pulled the packet of estate documents that Brizette's estate attorney had given me, and he read them. And when he was done, he took off his glasses and he said, "Hollis, if you had signed this, you would have been a guest in your own house by Christmas." I had him draft new documents. Everything. Will, trust, power of attorney, healthcare directive. Tilda was named as the primary beneficiary of a trust I controlled until she turned 25. Ennis was named as the secondary, with full transparency on the trust's operation, but no power to alter it. Brizette was named nowhere, not in any document, not as a contingent, not as anything. Second, I started seeing my doctor. A new doctor, actually, in Charleston, because I did not trust my regular one not to have been chatted up by Brizette at some social function. I got a full cognitive evaluation, memory tests, mental status, the works. The report came back saying I was, in the doctor's words, exceptionally sharp for his age, with no indicators of cognitive decline of any kind. I had the report notarized. Bram put it in the safe. Third, Kobe kept building the file. Photographs, audio, a copy of the deed to the Hilton Head condo, and the LLC paperwork showing it was Garth's, a statement from a clerk at the Savannah Hotel who recognized them. A copy of the actual marriage certificate proving Garth was married to a woman named Cyprian in Atlanta. The file got thicker every week. I never opened it. I trusted Kobe. I trusted Odell. I was waiting. Fourth, and this was Bram's idea, I started laying a trap. I called Brizette. I told her I had been thinking about what she'd said, about the property being a burden, about planning for the future. I told her I was ready to start the process of restructuring things. I asked if she could set up a meeting with that estate attorney they had brought me. I told her I wanted to do it right. I told her I was tired and I trusted her and Ennis to do what was best. She was so happy. You could hear her smile through the phone. We scheduled it for a Saturday afternoon at my house. Ennis would be there. The estate attorney, a man named Forbes Cribley, would be there. Brizette would be there. Brizette would be there. And I asked, very casually, whether Tilda could be there too. I said I wanted her to see how grown-ups handle these things. I said it would be a lesson for her. Brizette hesitated for 1 second. Then she said, Of course Tilda could be there. That was her mistake. Bringing a child to the slaughter of her grandfather. The Saturday morning of the meeting, I called Ennis. I told him I needed him to come an hour early. Alone. Without Brizette. I told him I had something important to discuss with him first, just father to son. He sounded confused. He said Brizette wanted to come early too. I told him no. I told him this part was just for us. I told him that if he loved me, he would do this one thing without asking why. He came at noon. Brizette was scheduled for 1. I sat my son down at the kitchen table where his mother used to roll out biscuit dough. I put a glass of water in front of him. I put a folder in front of him. I told him I loved him more than anything in this world except his mother, and I told him that what was in that folder was going to be the worst thing he had ever read, and I needed him to read every page before he said a word. He read it. All of it. The emails, the texts, the photographs Cobby had taken, the marriage certificate from Atlanta, the line about Tilda being moppy. When he was done, he was crying. My son, my 46-year-old son, was crying at the kitchen table in the house where he grew up, and I sat next to him, and I put my hand on his back the way I had when he was 8, and his dog died, and I didn't say anything for a long time. Finally, he said, Dad, how long have you known? I told him. 6 weeks. He said, Tilda found this? I told him she had come to me on a Saturday morning in her pajamas. I told him she was 9 years old and she had known something was wrong and she had been brave enough to bring it to her grandfather. I told him she was the bravest person in this family and she was about to need both of us. He asked me what I wanted to do. I told him I had a plan, but it only worked if he could sit at this table in 45 minutes and pretend he didn't know any of this until the moment I gave him a signal. I asked him if he could do that. For Tilda. For his mother. For himself. He wiped his face. He said, Tell me when to move. At 1 o'clock, Brizette arrived with Forbes Cribley and Tilda. Brizette was carrying a coffee cake she had picked up from a bakery in town, and she was wearing the kind of dress she wore to church, and her smile was so polished I could see my reflection in it. We sat at the dining room table. The same table Margaret and I had bought at an estate sale in 1991. Forbes Cribley spread out the documents. He started explaining them to me in the slow voice you use with old people. Brizette sat next to him, nodding, occasionally reaching over to squeeze my hand and tell me how brave I was for doing this. Ennis sat across from me. He was very still. Tilda sat next to her mother. She was looking at the table. She was looking at the table the way you look at the floor when you don't want anyone to see your eyes. Forbes. Cribley got to the part where I would sign the power of attorney. He turned the document around. He handed me a pen. He smiled. I took the pen. I looked at Brizette. I asked her very gently, Daughter-in-law, before I sign, can I ask you one question? She said, Of course. I said, Who is Garth Pelletier to you? The smile stayed on her face for exactly 1 second longer than it should have. Then her face did a thing I will never forget as long as I live. It just emptied, like water out of a glass. She said, He's Ennis's business partner. You know that. I said, Is that all? She said, Yes. I said, Are you sure? She said, Hollis, what is this? I put the pen down. I reached under the table and pulled out the manila folder. Not the original. A copy. The original was in Brahm's safe. I set it on the table in front of her. I said, "Open it." She didn't. She looked at Ennis. Ennis looked at her. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Forbes Cribley said, "I'm sorry, what is happening here?" I said, "Mr. Cribley, I think you should leave. There's been a misunderstanding about today's meeting. My attorney will be in touch." He looked at Brizette. She didn't move. He gathered his documents very slowly, and he left, and the front door closed, and it was just the four of us at the table. Me, my son, my daughter-in-law, and my granddaughter, who was still looking at the table. I said, "Tilda, sweetheart, will you come sit with Grandpa for a minute?" She got up. She came around the table. She climbed into my lap, which she hadn't done in 2 years because she said she was too big for that, and she pressed her face into my shoulder. I said to Rosette, "Open the folder." She opened it. She looked at the first page. She looked at the photograph. She looked at the text thread. She got to the page where she had called her own daughter Mopey, and her face did the empty thing again. And she looked up at me, and she said, "Where did you get this?" I said, "It doesn't matter." She looked at Tilda. She started to say something. I said, Don't you say one word to her. Don't you look at her. You don't get to do that anymore." Ennis stood up. He walked around the table. He stood behind Brizette's chair. He didn't touch her. He just stood there. He said, "I want you out of the house by tonight. I want you to call your sister, and you can stay with her. You will not be alone with Tilda. You will not be alone with my father. The lawyers will handle the rest." Brizette started to cry. Real tears, finally, but not for the right reasons. She said, "Ennis, please. Please. We can talk about this. It's not what it looks like." He said, "You called our daughter Mopey." That was all he said. He said it very quietly, and she stopped crying because she understood finally that she had lost him not over the affair, not over the money, but over one word in a text message to a man who wasn't going to leave his wife in Atlanta anyway. She stood up. She picked up her purse. She walked to the door. She turned around, and she looked at me one more time. And I will tell you what I saw on her face, because I want you to know. I saw hate. Pure, clean, uncomplicated hate. The kind that comes from a person who has finally been told no, after a lifetime of being told yes, and cannot understand how the world has betrayed her. I held my granddaughter and I looked back at her and I did not blink. She left. The rest is the part you can guess. The divorce was ugly but quick, because the evidence was overwhelming. Rosette got the prenup amount, which Ennis had insisted on years ago at my urging, one of the few times I had interfered, and it was not generous. Garth Pelletier's wife in Atlanta filed her own divorce within a month, and she was even less generous, and Garth ended up in a one-bedroom apartment outside Macon, which I take a small and ungodly pleasure in knowing. Ennis got full custody. Brizette has supervised visitation every other weekend, 4 hours, at a center in Charleston. She has used 3 of those visits in the last year. Tilda no longer asks when her mother is coming. Ennis sold the house he had shared with Brizette and moved back into the bedroom he grew up in. He works from home now. He cooks dinner every night. He is learning to braid Tilda's hair, and he's terrible at it. And she laughs at him, and that is the sound I hear from my workshop most evenings. The sound of my son being laughed at by my granddaughter. And I tell you, after everything, that sound is the closest thing to grace I've known since Margaret died. The trust is set up the way I wanted. Tilda will be taken care of. Ennis will be taken care of. The workshop is still mine. The cedar siding is starting to weather, and I should probably do something about it. But I keep finding reasons not to. Tilda is 10 now. She comes over every Saturday. We watch westerns. She is getting good with the plane. Last week she made a small cedar box all by herself with a hinged lid, and she gave it to me, and she said it was for me to keep important papers in. I didn't ask her what she meant. I think I know. I want to leave you with this, and then I'll stop. If you're an old man like me, and you have a child who married someone you weren't sure about, and you have been telling yourself for years that it isn't your business and you should stay out of it, I want you to look at the people in your house. Look at your grandchildren. Look at how they behave around their parents. Children know. They know before we know. They know in a way we have trained ourselves to forget. And if one of them ever comes to you in pajamas in the morning with something in their hands and a look on their face like they are about to be in trouble for telling the truth, you do what I did. You open the folder. You believe them. You move. Because dignity, the kind that matters, the kind that survives a lifetime, doesn't start when you decide to forgive the people who hurt you. It starts the moment you decide to protect the ones who came to you for help. That is what my granddaughter taught me, 9 years old, in her pajamas, in the doorway of my workshop on a Saturday morning in October. I will be grateful to her every day until I die. I think about that Saturday morning more often than I should. The pajamas. The manila folder too big for her hands. The way Tilda would not meet my eyes until I told her she had done the right thing. Everything that came after. The lawyers and the trackers and the cold mathematics of protecting what was mine. All of it started with one 9-year-old child being braver than the adults in her own house. I have come to believe that nothing in a family happens out of nowhere. Brizette did not become what she became overnight. She made small choices, year after year, and each choice made the next one easier. And by the time she was sitting at my dining room table with a smile and an estate attorney, she had walked herself, one comfortable step at a time, into a place where calling her own daughter Mopey in a text message felt normal to her. That is how rot works. Slowly, quietly, with your own permission. And I had let myself not see it. I had told myself it wasn't my business. I had been polite when I should have been paying attention. There is a kind of cowardice that wears the costume of good manners, and I wore it for years, and Margaret would have been ashamed of me if she had lived to see it. What saved us was not luck. It was 3 things, and I want my granddaughter to remember them when she is old enough to understand. The first is character. You cannot teach a child to be brave by lecturing her. You teach her by being the kind of grandfather she can run to in her pajamas. Tilda came to me because somewhere in the small accounting a child keeps of the adults in her life, she had decided I was safe. I had not earned that on the morning she walked into my workshop. I had earned it on 1,000 quieter mornings before, building her a stool, teaching her the grain of pine, listening to her talk about her dolls when I would rather have been doing almost anything else. The second is mind. I did not confront Brizette that day, although every cell in my body wanted to. I sat on my porch with bourbon I did not drink, and I made myself think. A man who acts on his first feeling will lose to a person who has been planning for a year. Anger is a tool. It is not a strategy. Use the feeling, then put it down, then pick up the pen. The third is endurance. 6 weeks is not a long time on a calendar. It is a very long time when you are pretending every day that you do not know what you know. I had to sit across from Brizette at family dinners. I had to thank her for coffee cake. I had to smile at the woman who was planning to put me in a home. Endurance is not the loud part of strength. It is the quiet part, and it is the part most men my age never learn until it is too late. Tilda made me the box, and I keep important papers in it now, but really what I keep in it is the morning she came to me. That morning is the most valuable thing I own, and I built a whole house with my own hands.